Entering the second phase of the drawing, I'm still really developing the composition and also the values in this project. I've allowed the cropping of this portrait to grow a little bit organically, partly to fit a conception that I have of the portrait in my mind beforehand, but also to allow myself a little bit of wiggle room to make changes as I go. I find that a drawing made with this material that has this rough, gritty sense to it really benefits from this kind of flexibility, whereas something like an ink wash, for instance, may not. We do finally have enough of the face and head rendered out to allow us to dramatically improve the sense of accuracy and construction in the portrait. I mentioned in the first video that we needed to take a more patient approach to accuracy within this portrait, and now we're ready to take full advantage of that mindset. By that I mean, at every stage of the drawing, we need to be assured of the possibility to make changes. I also want to say a few words about how we can think about accuracy. We want to capture the essence of the subject, and we have to trust in that to create a beautiful drawing out of our efforts. Back to the technical side of this project though, right now we're in need of developing some very specific shapes within the light. Those shapes have to be sensitive and relatively accurate. Not only that, but they also have to conform to the lightness of the plane that they're applied to. Most of the face is a very high key value, and because of the bluntness of our drawing tool, namely the sepia stick that we're using, we have a need for something that the medium does not necessarily want to do on its own. Here enters then the paper stump. I say a lot in the other tutorials that I make, usually using graphite, that students should be very cautious not to over-stump their drawings. This is a moment where we really need to let that idea go, because in this project, most of the rendering is going to take place using a stump. Not only to apply the values, but also to refine them and push them into the shapes that we desire. To achieve the level of rendering that we're looking for, there really isn't a product on the market that I've been able to find in either Sanguine or Sepia Chalk that actually allows you to create that rendering with a direct application of the medium. So instead, we have this intermediary. There is of course still the same caution that goes along with the use of a paper stump. Some of the problems it can tend to cause is an overall smudginess or softness to the halftone shapes that you create. I can also caution you that too much paper stump and too hard an application of it can risk to damage the paper, but with a little bit of caution I think we can avoid this and still have a really beautiful surface at the end of the project. So starting out part 2, it's important to identify what our objectives are in this moment so that we can get this drawing closer to where it eventually needs to be without taking too much of a kind of circuitous route. That's going to mean that eventually this is the stage where we identify where our darkest dark is, both in the source image and where we're going to choose that to be in our drawing, and also how we're going to identify what that value will be in this drawing. Now let me explain that just a little bit. So this photograph essentially has a value scale that is, for instance, about this wide, meaning that if the 10 or the darkest value is down here and the 1, the lightest value, is up here, we have the full spectrum of value from here to here available to us. Our drawing, however, as dictated by the limitations of the medium itself, is only going to get us maybe to here in terms of value. Let's say that is going to be about a 7. So this is the problem that we're identifying. Here we have a true darkest dark. Here in our drawing, our darkest dark is going to be really not so dark at all. For me, that means 7, 8, 9, and 10 are all going to be roughly compressed into a single value. What this means in relationship to our source image is that an area like this, which is relatively dark, I'm going to look at that area and squint down, so I'm almost looking through my eyelashes at the source image. And I'm going to try my best to see the uniformity of value within that shape rather than the variety within that shape. Let's also have a conversation about the hair. When I chose this source image to work from, and when I chose this model to work with, I understood that the hair was going to represent a very particular kind of problem. What I want to say here is that while I am drawing the hair, I'm going to be looking for the spirit or the essence of the hair, not the photographic representation of it. That's going to eventually mean grouping value shapes, much like I'm doing at this lower left-hand side here. As I see it, in that area, we are starting to kind of turn away from the light source. And a lot of that value eventually can be keyed down in favor of indicating that turning form, so that another area like this one, through containing a relatively lighter value, can show that it's turning a little bit more towards the light source. If we study individual parts of the hair, like this particular strand through here, we can notice a particular set of directional rhythms that run through that particular lock of hair. This set of rhythms is meant to indicate something three-dimensional, something twisting and turning in space. And by studying that rhythm and gesture, I can get a little bit closer to understanding how the shapes that I make in my drawing eventually should reveal themselves. Curly hair in a drawing, of course, doesn't look like this. it looks a lot more like this. And so eventually the contours of the shapes of the hair that I make should take on that slightly more sophisticated and elaborate arrangement of angles. For me, this is essentially the place where I feel most creative and artistic, meaning that drawing the hair for me is mostly a case of interpretation. Whereas drawing the features of the face, there are certain fundamental, unbendable concepts at work that I need to subordinate myself to. So that is the message for all of you out there. The hair is the moment for you to embrace your artistic license. And as a colleague of mine once put it, this is the place to express your taste. So please embrace that. So at this point of the drawing, we've really started to advance the values to the extent that we can start to see really the isolated highlights making themselves apparent on the surface of the skin. And that means, of course, that another layer of shapes needs to start being described. The highlights themselves, up until this point, because we're drawing on a relatively white paper, have been hidden by the light values around them. And so their specific shape has not been so necessary to describe. But that time is past now, and we need to start looking at the distinction between even the lightest of values. Something else that's coming to light in this moment is the relationship in between the darkest halftones and the darkest values overall. I get a lot of questions from students about areas like these in specific. The question tends to go something like this. As I observe in the source image, an area like this seems to me really quite light. Why did you draw it so dark in your drawing? The answer actually lies outside of that plane, and it relates to exactly what I was describing a moment ago. Remember that value scale that I talked about? That goes from 10 at the darkest to 1 at the lightest. And remember that the darkest value in my drawing is more like a 7, whereas the darkest value here in the source image is for sure a 10. That means that necessarily if I have a halftone value that's a 5, it's going to seem a lot closer to the darkest dark than it would in our source image. But essentially, this is the game that you play when you have a limited value scale available to you. If Sepia Chalk has a value scale that goes maybe from 1 to 7, oil paint will maybe get you to an 8 or a 9. But this is where it gets really fascinating to me, because no matter what the darkest dark in our drawing could be, it could never really be as dark as the darkest dark in nature. And so what do? We have to compensate by managing our value scale efficiently. And that means sometimes a halftone like this one right here might look a little bit dark in relationship to your source image, but will reveal really well the highest key plane. Your assignment in this moment is to take a look at the value relationship between your highest key planes, your darker halftone planes, and your darkest dark. Try to understand how dark you're going to need to make your dark halftone planes in order to reveal the brightness and luminosity of the highlights as it exists in your source image. This is going to require a little bit of interpretation and a little bit of an artistic leap on your behalf. Not to mention, by the way, all the technique necessary to get those nice dark halftone values even and unified. Coming to the close of this intermediate phase of the drawing, we have what seems to be quite a well-developed drawing. And this is the moment truly where we can start to push for a level of complexity and sensitivity that befits a really great portrait drawing. It's a time that I like to stop and consider what's working really well, but also emphasize the places where I think I really need to turn my technique up to 10. The hair at this moment is starting to take on a very interesting character. Some of the grouping of values that I talked about earlier in this video is taking place in a way that I think is relatively efficient and reinforces the sense of volume and form around the head, but realistically in this moment I feel like we still need more detail in those shapes. In addition, I find myself feeling simultaneously that I like the aesthetic of her blouse, but I certainly don't feel like as a whole it is yet working. The face itself, while developing at what I feel is a pretty decent pace, is desperately in need of clarification in some of the lightest halftone areas. Another area that I've been having a lot of trouble with is here on the side plane of the cheek. I have this very distinctive shadow shape that I need to indicate here just below the cheekbone, but I also need it to be relatively soft. As much experience as I have, I don't feel like I often get things right the first time. It takes experimentation, and that takes flexibility. It also requires a really good technique. Remember that throughout this drawing you want to avoid being heavy-handed, which is to say that some of the darker accents that I've placed on edges throughout the drawing really require so much caution as well as confidence. I say that because if I were to go into this area with a very stark and intense contrasting edge, trying to get the sense of shadow that I see here in the source image, eventually I would find myself scarring the paper, leaving behind ghost lines like these ones, except in an area that really cannot afford to have them. So for all of you out there drawing this project with me, keep your hand light, especially within the features. There's very few things that in my experience can really mess up a drawing, but a heavy hand in a sensitive area is one of the ones that I feel like can do that. As I observe my drawing, something else that I feel is a kind of flat out mistake is actually the lightness of the value here. I compared very well the value from left to right here, but failed to compare both of these values to an area like that of the forehead, which is overall much lighter. Eventually, stopping and looking at our source image, it seems to me very obvious. And this is why these calm moments of reevaluation are so important. When we're in the heat of the moment, it's difficult to keep all the necessary things in our mind active at once. You can think of it as if we were drawing fast and slowly. There's a lot of labor and technique required to make enough value on the paper and enough detail on the paper to constitute a really finely rendered drawing. And that necessity brings us very close to the paper for extended periods of time. So making sure that when you take breaks to look at your drawing from across the room can ensure that you're able to balance that sense of up close versus far off perspective.